The real power of the perspective grid becomes apparent when you start placing artwork into the grid. And rather than actually drawing the grid, a more common workflow that I use personally is I prepare the artwork and then bring it into the grid. And I find that a lot easier than drawing in the grid, which can be a bit awkward. So if you want to follow along, open Perspective Grid Superhero Start, and you'll see that I already have a perspective grid set up. By the way, I can save my perspective grids by going to Perspective Grid, Save Grid as Preset, and I could call this Marvel Superhero Building Perspective. And this is what I'm going to use for creating my Marvel superhero perspective. And you can adjust all the settings in here if you want to, even changing the colour scheme. So let's click OK and leave those settings for now. Now in here I've got two artboards. If you can't see your artboards in your layers, go up to the window menu and bring them up by choosing them in this menu. And you'll notice if I double click on number 2 artboard that I have some graphic elements that I'm going to bring into my scene. Now if I zoom out using Command- on the keyboard, what I can do is select the artboard tool and just move that closer to my composition. And now I can zoom in around there and I have access to my main artboard, which is this one, and the graphic elements. And this is how I tend to work when I'm working with perspective grids. I create an artboard for my elements and another one for the final artwork. I've got a few elements in here. I've got a pattern here that was created using the transform tool, or a repeating pattern, which I'm going to use for windows. I've got a pattern filled rectangle here, which I'm going to use for walls. And then I've got a couple of plain solids with gradients in them that I'm going to use for the sides of the buildings. So basically the way it works is you have this widget and you choose on the widget which side you want to place artwork onto. In order to do that, you need to actually select the perspective grid tool. And while you're in there, if you pull off this strip, it will give you access to both the perspective grid tool, keyboard shortcut Shift P, and the perspective selection tool. Shift V is the shortcut for that. Now, don't be too hard on yourself if you keep accidentally selecting the selection tool. It's a hard habit to break. So you will find the perspective grid a little bit awkward to begin with, but just persevere with it, and I promise you'll love it. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the perspective selection tool, and we're going to select this piece of artwork here. Now, if I was just to drag it into my composition, you'll notice nothing's happening. I need to actually select an active grid. So I'm selecting the orange part of the cube as my grid. And now when I hover over this, I get a little arrow indicating the fact that I can now drop that into my perspective grid. Now, the only thing is that gets rid of the artwork, and I need it for this side of the building. So I'm going to undo that. And when you drag it, if you hold down the Alt key, just like in regular drawing, you create a copy. And we'll place that into perspective. And if I adjust it using the selection tool, the perspective selection tool, I can make a change to it. I can adjust the size, and however I adjust it, it will remain in perspective. Now, if I was to adjust it using the regular selection tool, it goes way out of perspective and I lose all sense of perspective. So don't use the selection tool. If you do, don't be too hard on yourself. Just undo and go back to the step before. Now I'm going to bring this side of the building in. Now, if I was just to drag it in, holding down Alt again as I drag, it will place it into the same perspective as this one. So it looks as if it's just sitting behind it. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is click on this plane, and that makes the blue plane active. So when I hold down the Alt key and drag this time, it's going to place that into the blue plane, and I can snap it using my smart guides to intersect it with the other one. Again, release the Alt key or Option key on the Mac and just resize that if I need to. Okay, so we've got the two sides to our building. Let's create a roof. Here's my roof. Again, I'm going to hold down the Alt key, but before I do, I'm going to click on the horizontal grid. Now that might seem counterintuitive, but this is the flat plane at the top, the green one. And if I hold down the Alt key, I can click and drag and just place that on the roof of the building. Again, using this tool if I need to adjust it, scale it, or change it in any other way. Now, if we have a look at the Layers panel, you'll notice it's placed the roof on top of all the other layers. So if I was to select the wall layer and make it bigger, I can't actually see it because it's actually behind the roof. So sometimes you'll need to move elements in the layers panel. So you'll see now that I can extend the wall and it goes above the roof. So you can do things like that. And the other thing that we could do is maybe create another horizontal plane to kind of create a lip for the edge of the building. We could do this by dragging the lighter plane in, holding down the Alt key, so placing it onto the roof, like so. Get it roughly in place. I'm going to place it at the top of the layer stack, and I'm going to scale it like that, and scale it like that. And we're starting to create the impression of having like a kind of lip to the edge of the building. So we'll do that again, hold down Alt, pull that in. This time I'm going to scale it this way, and this way. And we need to move it on top again. So you see what's happening. I can adjust the gradient as well if I need to. If I want the lighter areas here, I could select the gradient tool and make an adjustment to that if I need to. So probably the easiest thing would just be to rotate that gradient or something like that. But I'm not going to do that now. I've done that in the finished one though. And I can also duplicate that. So I can hold down the Alt key and pull it across. Now you'll notice if I do it with the selection tool, it doesn't work. So I make mistakes all the time as well as you. I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and now with the perspective tool, I can drag it across. If I hold down Shift, it will constrain it as well. And we'll do the same with this one. Hold down the Alt key, drag it across to the other side of the building, and we've created 4 edges. Now, instead of taking the time to actually adjust the gradients, all I'm going to do is just change the fill colour. And we'll change it to a single colour, like that, or maybe slightly creamier, something like that. So once I have the main part of the building, then what I can do is I can start to add decoration to the building. So what I'm going to do is bring in this pattern here. Now again, I'm holding down Alt and clicking and dragging, place it into perspective, but something weird happens. You'll notice if I create a grid using transform or using any kind of appearance, it doesn't really work that well with the perspective grid tool. And you'll see here, basically what I've done is I've used the transform effect to create a repeating pattern. So I'm going to undo that and show you a fix for that. And with Illustrator, usually the fix is you select it and you go to Object, Expand Appearance. And once the appearance is expanded, I can Alt-click and drag it down to here, place it onto the side of my building, and then we'll also place one onto the blue plane at the side there. And of course you can repeat these as many times as you want. So we have a rough building. I'm also going to create another building over here. So I'm going to zoom out using Command- on the keyboard. And I'm going to take this plane, the orange one, and I'm going to move it back really far, okay, to there. And that's going to allow me to create another building in the background. With that done, I'm going to Command+ to zoom back out again. And similarly with patterns, what you want to do is just expand it, okay? So if you have an appearance, expand appearance. If you have a pattern, just expand the fill and stroke. And then I can drag it onto my building. Now, because it's quite a complex pattern, that's going to take a little bit of time to update. And again, I haven't selected the correct edge. So I'm going to select that as my active edge, drag it in, and that will place my brick pattern in here as a wall behind the other building. So that's my building pretty much finished off, or at least the first stages of it. What I'm going to do is open up another one where I've taken it a bit further and explain the other steps that I've done here. So if you go into Perspective Grid Superhero End, in here you'll notice that I've created a bit more detail in the building. So I've created a proper lip to the edge of the building there. And I've placed a building side in here. And if I select these, you can see that I can actually select those planes still using the perspective selection tool. Now I've also placed onto another layer in the background, not using the perspective grid tool at all. I've placed a silhouette of a kind of city background and a sunset. Now there's also a moonlit nighttime scene as well, so if you prefer moonlight to the sunset, you can have a moonlit scene, and that's absolutely fine. So that's a little bit about how you can place artwork into a perspective grid to create some dynamic perspective for a cartoon in order to place my Marvel character into the scene.